It was supposed to be just another stop on a long road trip, one of those nights where you just need a place to rest, away from the highway, and hopefully with a soft bed. I had been driving for hours, too many hours, when I spotted the faded sign off to the side of the road. Glenmore Hotel. It was an old place, maybe not the kind of spot you'd pick for a relaxing getaway. But I wasn't looking for luxury. Just something basic, something with a roof over my head. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the dim lights flickering like they didn't quite want to work. A chill crept down my spine as I looked at the front of the building. It was dark, but not just the absence of light. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the entrance. The heavy wooden door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Stale air mixed with something metallic, like the scent of rust and dust. There was no bell to announce my arrival, just the soft shuffle of my boots on the old carpet. Behind the check-in counter sat an older man, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His name tag read Frank. "One night," I said, as I dropped my bag on the counter. He didn't seem to move at first, as though he was studying me. Then, after a long moment, he slowly reached for the keys, his fingers shaking slightly. He slid a key toward me without a word. "Room 217, he said softly, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want anyone to overhear. I frowned. "Is that the only room available?" His gaze shifted, his eyes darting briefly to the window, then back at me. "It's the only room left." I didn't press him. I just took the key and nodded, giving him a polite smile that felt hollow. I could feel the weight of the key in my hand as I made my way down the hallway. The wallpaper, once a light shade of yellow, was peeling at the edges, and the dim light above flickered as if it couldn't quite decide whether to stay on. The carpet underfoot was worn, with visible stains that seemed to be from something much older than the building itself. The silence was suffocating, only broken by the creaking of the old wooden floorboards beneath me. Room 217. When I reached the door, the brass number 217 was barely visible, scratched and worn down from years of use. I inserted the key into the lock, the sound of the mechanism turning echoing down the empty hallway. The door opened with a groan, and I stepped into the room. It was strange. The room looked like something stuck in time. Furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. An old bed, a faded floral-patterned duvet, and a single window that seemed to barely let any light in. The walls, once a bright cream, were now stained with water damage in places, and the air was thick, as if it hadn't been properly aired out in years. I shrugged it off, setting my bag down and taking a deep breath. "It's just one night," I muttered to myself, as if repeating it would make everything okay. I moved toward the bed, but then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A mirror on the wall opposite the bed. It wasn't just any mirror. It had an odd shape, almost too ornate, with twisted, almost grotesque carvings surrounding it. I shuddered and quickly turned away, deciding not to look at it again. The room seemed off. The air was thick and cold, much colder than it should have been for a room with the heater running. I adjusted the thermostat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The cold remained, creeping up my spine as I began to unpack my things. I was about to sit on the bed when I noticed something else, something strange. There was an old chair by the window, facing toward the wall. I froze. The chair wasn't in any way out of place, but the fact that it was positioned to face the wall instead of the window gave me an eerie feeling. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it, I heard a sound, like a soft tap, 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 coming from somewhere in the room. I couldn't place where it was coming from. It wasn't the wind. There was no rain outside. My heart began to race. I turned around quickly, scanning the room. Nothing seemed amiss. The mirror, the chair, everything seemed frozen in time. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I froze. The tap-tap-tapping continued, coming from the chair, the one still facing the wall. My heart pounded against my chest, each beat louder than the last. I knew, deep down, that this was no longer just my imagination. Something in this room, something in this hotel was alive, aware, and it was not happy that I was there. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chair, even though every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave, to run, to get out of that room. But the door, I knew the moment I turned my back, the moment I let my guard down, something would happen. And then, as if in slow motion, the chair creaked. The wood groaned under an invisible weight. The back of the chair slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to turn toward me. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like the very air around me had grown heavier, pressing down on my chest. The chair finally faced me fully, and for a split second the room was still too still. The tapping had stopped. The air was thick with something unspoken, some heavy presence in the room that was suffocating everything. Then I saw it. At the edge of the chair, just below where the seat met the floor, something small and dark moved. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. It was crawling. Tiny fingers, too many fingers, scratching at the floor. I felt bile rise in my throat. I couldn't look away, couldn't pull my eyes from the movement as it slowly, inch by inch, began to climb up the chair's legs. My body screamed to move, but I was paralyzed. The tiny fingers continued to crawl up the side of the chair, and when they reached the seat, the movement stopped. For a moment I hoped that it was over. But then, the seat of the chair shifted. Slowly, deliberately, something or someone was settling in. The cushion compressed under an unseen weight. I could almost hear the faintest breath, long, slow, like something breathing out its last sigh. Then came the voice again. The whisper, louder this time, clearer. Get out. This time it wasn't a suggestion. It was a demand, an order. I snapped out of my trance, every cell in my body screaming for me to move. I rushed toward the door, my hands shaking violently as I fumbled for the key. I could feel the air behind me grow colder with every passing second, as if something was closing in, following me. I wrenched the door open, but just as I stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I staggered backward, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. The hall was empty, eerily quiet. I turned back to the door, but my hand hovered in midair before I could reach the handle. Something was wrong. I could feel it, a presence pressing against the other side of the door, waiting, watching. Then, in the stillness of that cold, empty hallway, I heard a sound soft like a whisper, but so close, it was as if it was right in my ear. You can't leave. I stumbled back from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart hammered in my chest, so loud I thought it might burst. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit hallway stretching before me. But the air around me had changed. It felt oppressive, thick, as if it was closing in on me from all sides. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of this place as fast as possible. But the hallway stretched on, seemingly endless. The only exit was the door behind me, the one that had just slammed shut, the one that now felt like a trap. I turned back toward the door. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of the room was still there, clinging to me like a second skin. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back to that room. But I didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, I slowly approached the door again, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But then I froze. I felt it before I saw it. Something off. The hallway stretched out in front of me, as it always had, but something was wrong with the walls. They seemed to distort, just on the edge of my vision. They were closing in, bending inwards, as if the space itself was warping. I took a step back, panic rising in my throat, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the window, the reflection of the hotel's dim light flickered in the glass. But the reflection didn't match reality. I could see myself standing there, facing the door, but in the reflection, I wasn't alone. Behind me, in the mirror, I saw the chair. The same chair from the room, now sitting in the middle of the hallway. And sitting in that chair, it was there, a figure, dark, twisted. Its features were indistinguishable, covered by shadows, but its eyes, they were clear, two glowing orbs staring directly at me. I could feel its gaze pierce me, the cold, suffocating pressure of its presence tightening around my throat. I didn't move, couldn't. My body refused to obey. The figure in the reflection raised its hand slowly, pointing at me. "Leave now." The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, demanding. My pulse raced in my ears, drowning out everything else. Without thinking, I spun on my heel and bolted toward the stairs at the end of the hallway. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence, but the footsteps behind me, they were louder. Something was chasing me. I reached the staircase and tore down it, heart pounding in my chest, the weight of the shadow on my back urging me to run faster. The air in the stairwell was thick, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, as if they were alive. I didn't dare look back. I burst through the lobby, the sound of my shoes slapping against the worn tile. Frank, the old man behind the counter, was gone. The desk was empty. The place felt abandoned, like no one had been there for years. The front door was just a few feet away, but as I reached for it, I saw the reflection in the glass. The figure was there, standing just behind me, close enough that I could feel its presence. It was waiting. I turned the handle and yanked the door open. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I stumbled out into the parking lot, gasping for breath. But when I looked back at the hotel, I saw it, the room I had stayed in. The window on the second floor was wide open, and from inside I could see the chair facing the window. But there was no one sitting in it. It was waiting. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. The engine roared to life when I turned the ignition, and I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, speeding away from the hotel. The headlights cut through the darkness as I drove faster and faster, the reflection of the hotel growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But even as I sped down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The thought of what I had left behind haunted me. The figure in the reflection, the whispers, the tapping. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I had escaped, but deep down I knew the truth. The hotel wasn't done with me. I didn't stop driving for hours. I didn't dare look back, not even once. I needed to get as far away as possible. But no matter how far I drove, the unease never left. Finally, when the sun began to rise, I pulled into a small diner off the side of the highway. My hands were still trembling as I got out of the car, my entire body stiff with exhaustion. The diner was empty, save for the old waitress behind the counter. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, but I didn't care. I just needed to sit down, to breathe for a moment. I ordered coffee, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't. My mind kept replaying the events over and over again. And that's when I saw it. A newspaper left on the counter. The front page had an old photo of the hotel, the same faded building I had stayed in. The headline read, "Glenmore Hotel, another disappearance in a long history of tragedies." My blood ran cold as I read the article. It described a string of strange disappearances over the years, people who had checked into the hotel only to vanish without a trace. The police had investigated, but no one had ever found any evidence. Some said the hotel was cursed. Others believed it was haunted. But the thing that caught my eye was the name, a name I recognized, Frank. The article described how Frank had been the hotel's manager for over 20 years. But there was something else, the last line of the story. A small detail buried in the text. Frank was never found. Authorities believe he vanished along with the others in the early 90s. I stared at the article, my mind racing. Frank was gone. He had never been there. The man I had checked in with was nothing more than a shadow. And the hotel was alive. It had been waiting for me, just like it had waited for all the others. I stood up from the counter, my legs shaking, and walked toward the door. As I stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. The chill from the night had finally lifted, but the weight of what I had experienced, the weight of the hotel, stayed with me. And just before I got into my car to leave, I heard a whisper, faint but clear. "We're still waiting." I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to think about it anymore. About the hotel, the figure, the whispers, the chair that had somehow become the center of my nightmare. I just needed to move on. I needed to forget. But as I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, I felt it again. That familiar unease creeping up my spine. The air felt too still, too quiet. For a moment, I was paralyzed. I glanced up at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hotel's flickering lights or the shadow of something standing behind me. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath and drove off, the miles stretching between me and that damned place. But the further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed. It was subtle at first, a strange sense of déjà vu, like I had driven down this same road before, like the world around me had become a loop, a trap. Then the feeling of eyes on me became impossible to ignore. I looked in the mirror once again, this time more carefully, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the reflection of the rearview mirror, was Frank. But he was different now. His eyes, once hollow, were wide open, glowing an unnatural yellow. His face was gaunt, stretched tight over his bones, like his skin had been pulled too far. His mouth opened slightly, and I could almost hear the words forming on his lips. "You can't escape." I slammed my foot on the brake, swerving the car to the side of the road. My heart was hammering in my chest as I turned to look behind me. The road was empty, nothing but the vast, endless stretch of pavement and trees. But I could still feel him there in the reflection, watching, waiting. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the land. I turned my head to glance at the sky, but the reflection in the mirror was always there, always watching me. No matter where I looked, Frank's face stayed locked in place, his eyes never leaving mine. And then it hit me. The hotel wasn't just some place where people checked in and checked out. It wasn't about the rooms or the chairs or the mirrors. It was about the people who were trapped inside it. People like Frank, like me, like all the others who had vanished over the years. The hotel didn't let you leave. Not really. Once you entered, you became part of it. You were its prisoner, and no matter how far you ran, it would follow you. It would wait, and eventually you would return. I knew in that moment that it was only a matter of time. I would have to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because the hotel demanded it. It had already claimed me, and when it did, I would be one of them. Just another lost soul trapped inside its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to check in. I looked at the rearview mirror one last time. Frank smiled.